in sociology. The basic idea is when you develop a theory, do you think of your theory as continuous with the vocabulary that exists in everyday life? That is, do you orient your theory according to ordinary language? Or do you think that there is a basic discontinuity between your vocabulary in theory and everyday life kind of vocabulary? That is, do you think that you need to develop an ideal non-ordinary language in order to develop your theory? Yeah. And I think this is a very useful distinction to think about different theories. And Aristotle is perhaps more on the ordinary side, Plato more on the ideal side. The Wittgenstein one is more of the ideal type, Wittgenstein two more of the ordinary language type, and so on. And so Luhmann is clearly here on the ideal language side of things. I already mentioned this little glossary and vocabulary he has developed as an example, but yes, he generally, I think, starts from this idea that just a non-participant view on social systems is helpful in order to understand society. A second important distinction we had already encountered is the one between, let's say, grand theory and a more of a middle range theory, which distinguishes itself by the degree of generality used, and Robert King Morton is associated with that term to see sociology just as a discipline that develops middle range theories, right, that apply to certain areas in society, but not to others. And Niklas Luhmann here is definitely on the side of the grand theory, where his theory is supposed to apply to the entire society. Yeah. Okay. Then one also characterization of Luhmann's theory when compared to Parsons is that Parsons' theory is called structural functionalism because it defined sort of the functions first in order to then see which structures would fit the functions. And Luhmann sees his theory rather as the reverse, where he first identifies structures in order then to derive the functions. This is in Luhmann's own terms the distinction. And we saw in the history of functionalism, it had started with a more simpler view of viewing systems as input-output based, and Luhmann was very much reading also about cybernetic theories, where it's more about the functional interdependencies also between systems, and this is more of his theory. So let's get to some of the basic notions of how Luhmann sees social systems. So think about sort of what Luhmann calls the unmarked space. So a state of nature in which there are no sort of rules, so no norms, no sort of distinctions between different entities, or there's basically just noise. Yeah. And against basically this, if you want, state of nature in Luhmann's terms, Luhmann develops what he calls an ontology of difference with reference to Saussure, the founder of linguistics and information theory. And an ontology of difference basically sees ontology as starting not with certain entities, but with certain distinctions between previously unmarked space. And the most important distinction that automatically creates systems for Luhmann is the distinction between the environment and the system. And this is a distinction that is made on the side of the system, right? Think about just a person saying that she is she, yeah, or I am I, yeah, by which this person on the side of the person creates a difference between the person on the one hand and everything else, which is called the environment, on the other hand. Think also about biologically about the development of cells, yeah, which develop at one point a certain membranial structure that creates a clear distinction between the environment, everything outside the cell, and the cell itself. Again, the creation of a system due to its distinction on the side of the system. Yeah. This is how autopoietically, right? So in decentralized forms of creation, Luhmann sees social order to emerge. So the answer of Luhmann to the basic problem of order that motivates most of the functionalist theories is social systems decentrally create orders by marking distinctions between themselves and the environment. Yeah. Once they have done this, they start to react to the environment and to communicate. And communication in Luhmann is always self-referential in the sense of referring to previous communications and thus creating sort of a system again. Think about, for instance, the system of science. Yeah, science is also a system in Luhmann's terms that refers a lot back to previous scientific communications by way of citations. Yeah. Think also about the political system, where in the political system, the opposition refers back to a previous political communication, namely the proposal of a government to do something, by reacting to this proposal in a negative way. This is also a communication in Luhmann's sense, which in a way reinforces, on the one hand, the creation of the political system vis-a-vis, for instance, the economic system, but it also enriches the political system internally, on the other hand, by way of making it more and more complex. So these communications, which refer to themselves over time, make social systems more and more complex. And complex here also means more and more internally differentiated. Yeah? So that, for instance, the political system develops within a certain party an internal opposition against the existing mainstream opposition, and so on and so on. Yeah. So Luhmann also inherits from Parsons this idea that there are different systems. So the name for, let's say, individuals in Luhmann's terms is the one of a psychic systems. There are biological systems. There are also social systems. There are subsystems. And so the psychic systems in Luhmann's terms are also in a way non-trivial machines, whereas social systems are just trivial ones. Last but not least, the question in Luhmann's sort of grand theory is obviously where is sociology actually? And sociology is what Luhmann would call a second order observer. It's part of the scientific system, scientific subsystem, and like social system, also psychic systems, they have the capacity to observe each other. Yeah? So they engage in sort of primary observations, but they often have this, what Luhmann calls the blind spot. So they do not necessarily observe that they themselves are participant entities in social interactions. And this, let's say, requires also institutions of second order observations, that is, systems that are installed in societies that make societies also more complex, which engage in observing primary level observations, right? Such that the sociologist observes, for instance, how one class in society observes another class in society in order to create different reference group comparisons, for instance. Yeah. Okay, so this is broadly the setup of Luhmann's system theory, which he then applied and elaborated in many different books, which are summarized again here in this 2020 volume, and in which he basically goes each and every subsystem in society to describe how it functions. Yeah, I mean, this can be read in a way as a functional instruction manual of how societies have historically functioned in the transition then to modern society, how complexer systems function nowadays. So the different subsystems can be grouped by what Luhmann calls the dominant code that is used in communication to distinguish the subsystem from other systems and to, let's say, create an internal communication within the subsystem. It can also be distinguished by the primary medium of communication used. So remember, this is very much like the generalized medium of exchange by Parsons. Within every system, there are certain, let's say, programs which are implemented